So sorry everyone. We had a power cut here, which turned off my computer, my internet. So I'm very sorry for that. So let's get a quick move on and try and finish the webinar because before something like this happens again. Um, Let me just quickly share my screen again. Oops. So here it is. Lastly, we saw the next example and how we can make um, mistakes when we're trying to access other scopes that are not currently in our reach and what kind of errors that causes. Thankfully, they're not fatal and they're pretty obvious, so it's not the worst thing in the world. So after we know a bit more about local scope and um, global scope, here's a handy analogy when thinking of the concepts of local and global scope. Um, we think about a one-way mirror. So um, a mirror that depends on which side you're on, you see beyond it or you don't. So if you're inside, so the in the inner side of the one-way glass, um, you're able to see what's on the outside. Um, this is just like when an inner function can access the scope of the outer function. Remember, that's the lexical scoping. If, however, you're on the outside of the one-way mirror, you won't be able to see what is on the inner side of the mirror. So this is the situation at all times of the global scope. It just can't see what's inside of every single function. This is also what happens with a parent function when it has a child function in it. Um, and parent functions cannot see what's inside of child functions. So this is an interesting way, I think, to think about the scope chain and scope in general. When you're thinking about scope, think of a one-way mirror and which function is on which side, and I think you'll get to the hang of it pretty easily. Okay, so now that we know something about all these intricate concepts like scoping, lexical scoping, local scope, global scope, let's look at a place where we can make use of them. The most common thing when we're thinking of an application for scoping, so a place where scoping is useful is closures. Um, Here we have a definition of what a closure is. Firstly, I want to say that closures are not a feature of JavaScript. They are just something that we create. So we have to construct a function. We don't have um, a closure readily accessible to us by writing some kind of by accessing some kind of variable. They are instruments. So we do this with functions, so we construct closures with functions and the understanding of the scope chain. So here's the definition. A closure is the combination of a function and the lexical environment within which that function was declared. This definition is very reminiscent of the ones we already encountered in the presentation previously. So it all revolves around a function and the lexical environment in which it is created. So closures are useful because they let you associate some data, um, so variables, objects, and the lexical environment with a function that operates on that data. So this has obvious parallels to object-oriented programming, which you'll learn a bit later in the course. Um, in object-oriented programming, objects allow us to associate some data, so the object's properties, with one or more methods. So methods are just functions that belong to an object. and they have access to the object's properties. And that's something actually that you're gonna have to do on the third project, so the arcade game. Consequently, you can use a closure anywhere that you might normally use an object with only a single method. Situations where you might want to do this are particularly common on the web. Much of the code we write in front-end JavaScript is event-based. So we define some kind of behavior, like for example a click or a submit, and then attach it to an event that is triggered by the user, such as a click or a key press. So we define functions and attach them to event handlers, which are called when the specific event we're listening for, so the click, the key press, the mouse down, occur. Our code is generally attached as a callback, so a single function which is executed in response to an event. Let's now see some practical use cases for closures. These are just three of the cases. There are many more, but I wanted to just display some so you know that closures are not just fancy show-off skills, but are very practical indeed. So the first one, making variables private, is pretty self-explanatory. So if you want to associate a set of variables, or they might not even be variables, they might be arrays or objects, functions, as we saw in the previous exercise. If you want to hide them from the global scope, um, we have to put them in a separate function. So um, if we want to associate a set of variables with a certain function, we can actually use a closure. Let me uh, digress a bit here and say something about the global scope. So if we put something in the global scope, this this thing, whatever it is, like a variable or an object or a function, it is immediately put on the global object, which in the browser, so mostly we're gonna be running our code inside of browsers. Um, in the browser, the global object is the window object. So if you go in the console and type window, you will see the global object and all the variables that we declare in the global scope that are not inside of functions go on that object as properties, and whatever value we have assigned to these variables is the value that gets returned when we access those variables. To access the global object again, we have to type in window. So that's something I wanted to explain. Let's return to the practical uses of closures. The second one, function factories, is probably the best use case for a closure. We'll see an example of that in a bit, but in a nutshell, function factories are like functions that have some kind of predefined variables in them, and they the functions return another function. And by making use of the second function, we can bind some kind of input and access the variables that were inside the first function to return some kind of what can I say, a string maybe. So that is repetitive over many calls of this function. So we'll see that in a bit. And finally, namespacing private functions. So many object-oriented languages provide the ability to declare methods as either public or private. and JavaScript doesn't have this functionality built in, so it does not come out of the box. But it does allow us to emulate this functionality through the use of closures, which is known as the module pattern. You'll learn all about that when you're um, building a third project again. So using closures to namespace private functions keeps more general namespaces clean. So the global scope is what's general namespace here refers to. So preventing naming collisions and allowing us to have variables with the same names but in different scopes so they don't mix up. So here we're talking about again the scope chain. Um, okay, I think that's enough of the theory. Let's look at two examples of closures. Let's just flip to the code editor. We will be seeing this presentation in a bit again. I'll remove that nasty screen. And here's the first exercise. So firstly, I'm going to show you the code just so you know what's going on. Here's the HTML for this demo. It's absolutely nothing special. Here we have a tiny script. This is called inline CSS. I'm not referencing here an external CSS file because I just have a single h1 and a button here. That's why I'm using the style tags and the inline CSS script. So we're gonna have, as you can see here, Flexbox is used to center these two things in the center of the page. And that's all the HTML is basically. And let's see the JavaScript, the interesting part. So here we have a variable again on a global scope, x, which is equal to 10. We have an f function, which again has a variable y equal to 15. And inside its local scope, there's a function returned here. So this is a prime example of a closure here. The f function is a closure. Here the g function, when we return that, we will have access to the outer scope here, even though it's not called by the f function. And here the display results, that's not connected to the function, the closures at all. So here I'm just selecting the element with a class of results, and I'm assigning the results to calling the f function. And remember, the f function returns the g function. So here in result, we have a function. And here, notice that the result HTML, the element we selected, I'm substituting whatever is in the HTML of the element with a class of results with whatever is returned by the function g as we have stored it here. So in theory, what should be in the results HTML variable which holds the result class, the element with a class of result, should be the result of this here, x plus y plus z. So x is 10, y is 15, and z is 25. So g here is the most nested function, and as we know from the scope chain, the most nested function has access to all the variables that are outside it. So it has access to the z variable within the local scope, to the y variable that's in the outer scope, so in the parent function's local scope, and x, which is in the global scope, which, as we already know, all functions get access to it. And here the start function just places the click event handler to the button, so we have some kind of dynamic thing going on and not just plastering the result of this here. So let's flip over to the browser to see what's going to happen. So here this is the HTML file. Here's the button. And when I click this button, we should see the result of this code. So remember, we should see 10 plus 15 plus 25, which is equal to 50. And that should be placed in the result HTML. Notice now that here the h1 of class result, there's nothing in it. So let's actually place something, I don't know, something, just to see that there's in fact an h1 here. Refresh the page and there goes something. And now that should be substituted with 50 if our code is correct. And there it is. I just clicked on the show result and it's substituted with 50. So that's an example of a closure. And that's a pure closure. And now let's see what function factories are. Here we don't have anything. This is the HTML file is completely bare and it just has a link to the JavaScript file here externally. And now here we have another example of a closure. This is the closure. It's a function that returns a function. If it's easier for you to remember it like this, remember that a closure is a function that returns a function. And that's the case here. So here we have two variables which are assigned to whatever gets returned. So this function gets returned from the Dwight job function. Here the Dwight job function accepts a parameter. Here it's salesman and manager, and it returns this function. So now the sales variable is essentially a function that knows that we've passed salesman in it. So if we call this function with another argument, remember here there's another argument, and whatever that argument is going to be placed first here. We're going to have a space, and we're going to have whatever we said here. So whatever we said the first time we called the Dwight job function, that's going to be placed last. There's going to be a space, and whatever we called last will be here. So here you can see in the comments that's what's going to happen. Top salesman, so we call the top first, because here sales, we have assigned the salesman, which is going to go last. So here the title. And now if we call sales with top, the top here will be placed in the place of prefix. So we have top salesman, we have the manager here, we assistant to the regional, which will be placed here, prefix, a space, and again the manager. And we have finally a regional here in the prefix, and the manager gets placed here back. So let's see if this will work. Let me just open it up. And notice that because we have alerts here, they're going to get alerted one after the other. So we should see top salesman first, assistant to the regional manager second, and regional manager third. Now let's open this up. And notice immediately that we have the alert top salesman. So our code is working. If we click OK, we get to the second one, which is assistant to the regional manager. And finally, the third one is regional manager. And with that, our code stops and there's nothing on the page because we haven't built anything. And that's essentially what I wanted to show you. Closures are not that difficult, but you have to know what scope is to understand them. There are some resources out on the web that I think will be useful to you when you're studying these difficult topics. The first one here, let me just show them to you. The first one is a Medium article on the site Medium that explains the scope chain and the execution context. This is definitely worth checking out because it's a pretty easy to understand article written for beginners. The second one is the page on the W3C, so the World Wide Web Consortium, that deals with what the JavaScript scope is. The next one is from NDN, of course. It deals with closures. This time, however, this article is written in fairly easy to understand language without many complex terms and little preconceived knowledge. So you're free to go and read that. MDN usually has very detailed and complex articles, but this one is not. It's an exception. So if you find it hard, there's another one listed right below the MGN, which is again by the World Wide Web Consortium that deals with closures. And finally, there's an article explaining the practical uses of closures. So make sure that you know all these before going to the Medium article here. And that's it for the presentation. We covered a lot of topics that are not easy to understand at first. So if you persist, however, and do the research, it turns out that everything is connected and logical. So yet and still, these concepts are getting trickier and trickier every week, of course, but this is only because you're getting smarter and smarter. So as you progress through the nano degree, you get to know more and more, and you get to tackle harder concepts each and every time. Hopefully, you learned something new and useful, which you can use on your projects from this presentation. I'm really sorry again for the power cut that we had. Hopefully, that's not going to happen anytime soon. Um, um, what else can I say? I wish you good luck with the third project. If you have any difficulty with it, feel free to message me at any time. You know where to find me on Slack. And thank you for sitting out with me through this webinar. And I'll see you next week. So good night and have a